So with Dr. Kleinman, I'm going to introduce him now, is a physician and anthropologist who is now in his 37th year at Harvard, a graduate of Stanford University and Stanford Medical School with an MA in social anthropology from Harvard and trained in psychiatry at the Massachusetts General Hospital. Kleinman is a leading figure in several fields: medical anthropology, cultural psychiatry, global health, social medicine, and medical humanities. He has conducted research in China from 1978 to the present, and in Taiwan from 1969 until 1978. In 1973, he taught Harvard's first course in medical anthropology, and in 1982, he inaugurated Harvard's PhD program in medical anthropology. He has supervised many PhD students, and he is a member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's the winner of the Franz Boas Award of the American Anthropological Association, the highest award of the association, and Distinguished Lifetime Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He has twice given the Distinguished Lecture at the NIH and was, until 2011, a member of its Council of Councils, the advisory board of the director. He chaired for a decade the Department of Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School from 93 to 2000. He was Presley Professor in that department. He is, and he has received a tremendous amount of awards, and the list goes on and on. I promise you, it's like, if I read all the accomplishments, it would take us a good 30 minutes at least. Kleinman is a member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He chaired the selection committee for NIH's first Pioneer Awards. He has delivered the Tanner Lectures at Stanford, along with many other noted lectures, including the Flory Lecture at the University of Adelaide, the B.D. Smith Lecture at Melbourne, Western Mark Lecture at Helsinki, and so on and so forth. And recently, he just is ending a tour of lectures in Stanford, Yale, China, and other places. I think he's just coming back home to his part of the world, which is Massachusetts and Maine too, to give one of these final lectures before he moves on to other things. And so we are tremendously, tremendously privileged to have a speaker of this caliber among us, and I'm looking forward to a great lecture and to your also equally great questions to him. So with that, thank you so much, and I welcome.
Well, it's great to be with you, and thank you for the kind introduction. We have a topic for tonight that I'll try to make light and enjoyable, but actually is serious and sometimes difficult, so you'll bear with me. But to set the right tone for it and give you a minute to catch your breath and me a minute to catch my breath, let me explain why I've been giving this talk, a talk like this, at many places around the United States, particularly American medical schools. And recently in quite a number of places. And what illustrates it is a story about a man who is the first soloist on the glass harmonica to be invited by a major orchestra, in this case the New York Philharmonic, to be a soloist and to privilege his instrument. And he practices and he practices and he launches into the Bach preludes, and he plays the preludes, and there's a standing ovation at the end, and in the back of the room, a little voice cries out, "Play it again." And he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so happy, I will play one of the preludes again." He plays that prelude, again a standing ovation, and in the back of the room, the small voice cries out, "Play it again," to which he responds, I'm just so delighted with this response, but I'm too tired, I'm exhausted, I can't play it again. And the small voice says, "You'll play it again until you get it right." So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get it right. And you can tell me at the end. You can tell me at the end if I got it right or not. Anyway, you can see I've been trying for years to get it right. And these are just some of the books I've done that really, in many ways, touch on the topic of today, which includes my first book, Patients and Healers in the Context of Culture, a book that I did that's taught at probably half of American medical schools, The Illness Narratives, and many others as well, including What Really Matters, which was on the table for sales tonight. And these are articles, a little more recent articles that I've done in the New England Journal of Medicine and The Lancet on the topic of caregiving. So what is caregiving? If we look up in the Oxford English Dictionary, we see that caregiving is characterized by attention to the needs of others, with an emphasis on professionally involved in the provision of health or social care, and the particular needs relating to children, the elderly, and invalids. But if we define caregiving ethnographically, that is descriptively in terms of what the content of caregiving actually is, we see that there's both an individual and collective practice of giving care, which involves such things as protection, practical support, emotional support, solidarity, etc. And involves physical, emotional, interpersonal, and moral forms of assistance. And I'm going to go into some details, particularly on the last one. And much of caregiving is reciprocal, and it's linked to the process of care receiving. And one of the ironies of caregiving is that there's a tendency to forget about how important patients and those who receive care are. This is a reciprocal relationship in which the receiving of care does not mean at all that the care recipient is passive. Now, there are many levels of caregiving, and I'm going to focus on only several. There's the level of humanitarian assistance, which is a caregiving in a sense at the collective level. There's professional caregiving, and I'll spend some time on this, which involves doctors or nurses or any of the allied health professionals in their interactions with care receivers. There's self-care, and we know more and more how important care of the self has become. And there's family and network caregiving, amongst other forms, including caring for animals and the environment. And I'm going to emphasize in this talk numbers 2, 4, and 3 and 4. Professional caregiving, self-care, family and network caregiving. Now, you'll excuse the pictures. They're from, I'm an Asianist, and I do most of my research in Asia, and so many of them are from Asia. So if we look at caregiving and the core tasks for family, close friends, and sufferers themselves, we have practical assistance: feeding, bathing, ambulating, toileting, protecting people from something happening, like falling down or being in a difficult place where they can't get out of. But caregiving is also about moral and emotional tasks, like acknowledging the humanness of the person who's being cared for, affirming their significance and their claims on us. It's about emotional support, and it's about both moral responsibility and solidarity. Of course, there are other aspects of caregiving, especially when we think of end-of-life caregiving, such as consultation and coordination with all kinds of experts, financial, legal, religious, etc. And caregiving is very much about presence. It's about the fullness that we bring to being there existentially, often when there's nothing practically that can be done, and maybe even when hope itself is extinguished. But even when we do things that are practical and when there is hope, just being there in our fullness, and I'm going to say more about that later on. Now, on a practical level, caregiving has little to do with medicine and other health professions. If you actually sort of sum up all the acts of caregiving, the vast majority of care is given in the lay sector. Partners, children, families, and the wider social network responsible for day-to-day realities of caregiving. Take, for example, and this often surprises people outside the United States, take elder care in the United States. If we look at the elderly, my age and older, we see that 70% of the elderly over 70 years of age are not in any kind of institution, but are either taking care of themselves or cared for in families, 70%. So that suggests just how enormously important what we would call family and network caregiving are. Now, from a moral perspective, caregiving is an existential act that's easy to see defines our humanity and relationships with others everywhere. It's one of the things that people everywhere will say really matters. It's obviously a basic response to dangers and uncertainties that define the human condition. And it is a form of aspiration as well as a burden. Well, I'll come to the burden in just a little bit. The reciprocal relation of caregiving can be seen as a kind of gift giving. This is how an anthropologist would see it, in which the sick person, in a sense, gives the gift of their needs, their need for help, to the caregiver who provides practical or moral responses. And this is particularly an important phrase to get across, that in a global culture of cynicism where there's a widespread sense often of misplaced loyalty, caregiving is frequently perceived as one of the truly worthy objects of ethical commitment. Now, I want to take a little stroll with me a little bit away from caregiving in order to understand what I mean by the moral. And if you get interested in this, you can either look at my book, What Really Matters, or look at the Tanner lectures that I gave at Stanford some years ago, which are published. So when I mean moral, I mean the following, that we're all engaged in worlds of moral experience. Those are our networks and also our work sites. This world of moral experience is moral because life itself is about values. Being alive, negotiating important relations with others, doing work that means something to us, as living a purposeful life, and living in some particular local place indicates that moral experience is inescapable. That is, we're always surrounded by values and contestation as well as agreement about values. But in addition to the moral experience of the worlds we live in, the local worlds we live in, we have our own moral life. And life is moral, we know, because there are people who are tone deaf to moral issues, and there are people who are frankly not interested and even harmful to others. But it seems to me in the course of a long life that most of us, if given the choice of doing the right thing and having the opportunity to do it, would like to do it. Now, as you can see by what I said, that the moral and the ethical are not the same. We could be committed to local values that actually are not good values. You could be part of a local clinic, for example, where there's a big sign that says, serve the people, but actually if you look at what people are doing, they're serving themselves in terms of generating money. So it's often in our practices that we show how moral experience may point to the hypocrisy of what we ethically claim. So the moral and the ethical are not the same. The moral are our practices, and often the practices in a world with others. And the ethical are our aspirations, both in terms of our own virtues and the principles surrounding us. And that gap between the moral and the ethical is crucial, because it means that both are essential. Ethics, that is, high-level principles like beneficence or social justice, are wonderful, but if unrelated to moral life and to moral experience, then the ethical becomes often irrelevant. And not just irrelevant, but often inadequate in terms of its inability to specify what the local is about. On the other hand, if we just deal with the local, with the moral, we could be trapped in worlds that are unethical and ourselves in commitments that are unethical. Hence, both are needed. Now, caregiving in families, I'm going to emphasize this. Caregiving in families is tough stuff. Think of all of us who are taking care of children, or adult children, or little children, being taken care of in turn by our adult children, taking care of the elderly, etc. Caregiving can be burdensome, can be extraordinarily difficult, amongst the most difficult things we do. There's the need to provide resources, financial, but also cognitive, emotional, moral, social, spiritual, to keep that caregiving going, to endure caregiving. There's a crisis in long-term care funding in our society, which has enormous implications for care. The challenge to values of family caregiving in an era of neoliberalism goes beyond what I can talk about today, but is a huge problem for our time. When we marketize everything in the caregiving domain, we lose something enormously important. Any of you who read Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations know that when Adam Smith emphasized markets, he said markets would destroy us if they weren't balanced by moral commitments. Now, I want to emphasize in this talk enduring. For people with serious chronic and end-stage diseases, and those that take care of them, strategies for enduring are central, and these include, are supported by moral commitments, as well as those religious and ethical values that make those moral commitments meaningful. And these strategies are as relevant for professional and family caregivers as they are for patients. Strategies of endurance, which I'm going to emphasize. I've already talked about presence, and I want to just come back to it again to say that presence is the absence of going through the motions. It's the absence of being mechanical about caregiving. Anyone who has had the experience of having an elderly family member in a nursing home and goes to see them and watches a health aide or a nurse do things in a mechanical way for a family member knows that that we all want presence. We want humanism, not just a mechanical way of doing things. Now, since the work of Max Weber, the great German sociologist in the early 20th century, we've been aware that life is organized around quests for meaning. This is especially true in settings of serious illness and health catastrophes, which basically knock all of us, not just the person affected, but the network and family, out of our routine way of doing things and call into question, what does it all mean, and how do we sustain meanings in the face of difficult times? Both religious and spiritual issues figure importantly in these quests for meaning. Now, quests for meaning can be witnessed in a number of ways, and I actually have tried to introduce ways of doing this into medicine. And so the explanatory models were 8 questions that I introduced that are used at almost all American medical schools to teach how to interview patients, how to take illness narratives, and try to getting at what is at stake in caregiving for people who are receiving care and for people who are giving care. The quests for meaning are frequently connected to our own quest for wisdom. It's not that any one of us ever arrives at wisdom, but living a purposeful life and taking care of others means that a quest for wisdom is really part of what caregiving is about. Now, there are criticisms of caregiving, and it's very important to entertain them because they're real. Over the course of history, many have felt that they were coerced into caregiving. This was true of many 19th and early 20th century American women who felt that everything was put on their shoulders, and perhaps that tradition continues into our time. Poverty led to the coercion of many, many people who could only find jobs at the lowest level of caregiving. And today, if we look at who does the lowest level of caregiving, home health aides, enormously important, but low on the pecking order in terms of resources and financial remuneration, we see that in Boston, where I'm from, almost entirely immigrant communities are the ones who are responsible for home health aides and hospital-based health aides. It's important to understand that caregiving is about avoiding burnout and avoiding abandonment. Many people who start off giving care, especially for the elderly, over time feel burnt out and will abandon their family members with great sadness, but with the feeling that they simply can't do it anymore. Caregiving is also about questions of quality and standards. You may be surprised to know we have no idea of what the quality and standards are for home health aides in the United States. There are more than 1 million home health aides in America. We have almost no understanding of what they actually do and what they should be doing. There's a question of resources. If we're going to emphasize health care by families and network members, caregiving by them, well, then there should be a sharing of knowledge resources and financial resources, rather than placing them all in the professional sector. And this is an issue that has really hardly been addressed. I'm going to leave the last one to later. Now, I want to talk a little bit about religious contributions to enduring in caregiving. For many caregivers and health professionals, religion is a crucial motivating factor and a source of perseverance and commitment. In this way, religion has served as a source of social and community support and solidarity, been important for the organization of practical assistance, and been responsible for sustaining moral strength and affirmation. Most of the time, professionals, take for example, in global health, the field that I do, don't talk about their religious roots, but actually, almost all global health professionals who've made major contributions have had important religious roots. You think of Halfdan Mahler, who really introduced primary care into the world's vocabulary with the Alma Ata meeting and the development of the WHO's commitment to primary care. Mahler came out himself of a medical missionary background. Jim Grant, who headed UNICEF and made UNICEF the most effective of all UN agencies, the most effective and crucial for in the area of vaccines. Jim Grant came out of a family tradition of missionary medicine. Many today, two of my former students who are very well known today, Jim Kim, who's now president of the World Bank, and Paul Farmer, who's probably the icon of global health in the United States, they both come out of strong liberation theology traditions. Now, to understand and harness the potential of faith for caregivers and health professionals, it's crucial to think in terms wider than organized religion, considering faith instead as lived values and an inchoate personal religiosity that recognizes the sacredness of relationships to others, our sensibility to care for the afflicted and marginalized, and our desire to do good in the world. Religion, ethics, and aesthetics help many to rework what enduring is so that it can be emotionally sustained and made morally meaningful. Religion, in a sense, provides the why that makes the how to endure supportable. And by religion, I don't just mean institutionalized religion at all. I mean those commitments to ultimate meaning that most of us at some deep level actually make. Now, the implications of what I talked about so far are to strengthen resources for caregiving in families so family cares can be sustained and it can be more effective. To revitalize caregiving in medicine and nursing, as well as in the education of healthcare professionals. To reform our healthcare systems to support caregiving activities. Right now, they don't support caregiving activities. For example, when I was early in my career, I worked on the electronic medical record. And the electronic medical record has no place in it for what we used to have as nursing notes, which came the closest to being able to tell the story about what the caregiving needs of patients were. Use the perspective of caregiving in other domains of social life, and I really want to end on this, so I'll keep it for the very end, and that is that I'm suggesting that caregiving is too important to be left just to medicine. It's something that might influence and change the way we deal with social welfare, criminal justice, education, environmental policy. Now, here I want to illustrate a lot of the issues with what I've just talked about in a way that'll be more enjoyable for you because they'll be in pictures rather than words. So this is a recent exhibition at MoMA in New York by Christopher Williams, who's an outstanding contemporary artist. And in this you don't see it very well here. It's a beautiful young woman who's fallen to the ground. And instead of picking her up, you see someone holding a light meter in front of her to get the picture right, okay? again, suggesting that it's easy in the world we live in to forget about the direct acts of caregiving and to actually emphasize simply the displays of care, almost like a voyeurism in this regard. It's also important to remember that people with the worst of diseases, with those that take away, rob our memory and our cognition, are still people. And this is, and therefore the caregiving for them needs to be humanly directed, even at the end. This is a self-portrait, really astonishing, by Willem Utemeulen, who's a Swiss artist who painted his own Alzheimer's disease. He basically painted what he experienced as Alzheimer's disease, suggesting that even when he was the part of most radical memory loss and the like, he still had a being. It's important to understand the historical roots of caregiving, and I'm going to go through a number of traditions very quickly, but this was the rule of the Hospital of Notre Dame in Tournai, and this is a 15th century Flemish painting. Rembrandt was extraordinary in his depiction of caregiving. This is a picture of his wife Saskia in bed, and meant to emphasize the interpersonality of caregiving, the structure of care in a domestic space between caregiver and care receiver. This is Rembrandt's portrayal of probably a physician by the name of Ephraim Bueno, who was a great Jewish physician in Amsterdam in the 17th century. And what Rembrandt has been celebrated for in this portrait is catching in Bueno's expression something profoundly human, that is at the same time compassionate, enduring, and with a tragic view. If you think about how limited were medical interventions at that time and how often doctors encountered situations that were hopeless. This is a great portrait, which I wish I had a better picture of. It was a self-portrait by Goya at a time that he thought he was dying. And if you see this picture in real life, as it were, you would see that Goya painted himself almost bloodless, completely anemic. And the doctor, florid, as if the doctor was filled with energy and vitality. And although the doctor is giving a potion to him, the meaning of it was in some way that the caregiver contributes to the vitality of the care receiver. This is Sir Luke Fildy's great portrayal of the doctor at the very end of the 19th century, when again, limited technical things the doctor could do, but being there was one of the things the doctor could do. And this is a little girl dying of a febrile illness, an infection with high fever. Her parents are in the back, you can see broken down. And there's the doctor both contemplating her and being with her, both clinically competent and compassionate. The person maybe who got caregiving the best in painting is Picasso, who was very, very interested in caregiving. And this is a painting you can see when you go to the Great Picasso Museum in Barcelona. And it's a fusion of the head of the caregiver and the care receiver, sort of emphasizing the fact that this interpersonal space brings them together. And of course, he's drawing on ancient tropes in this regard, since in the Western tradition, the classical portrayal of caregiving is the dead or dying Christ in the arms of the Virgin, with caregiving in the space between them. This brings us up to date with caregiving, shows the crucial role of family. It's pictures taken by partners and health workers in Lesotho of women dying with combined AIDS and multi-drug resistant tuberculosis in the context of their families. And now I want to be very personal. Because I learned a lot about caregiving from my own personal experience that went way beyond what I learned from a career of studying caregiving or giving it as a psychiatrist. So this is my marriage day in 1965, and that's my wife, Joan Kleinman. This is us early in our marriage. This is Joan and me in midlife. Joan again, Joan again, Joan and me in our 50s in our garden, Cambridge, Joan with Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's, in her 60s, Joan dying of Alzheimer's at 71 years of age, and Joan's grave in Mount Auburn Cemetery, a beautiful cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, I want to talk to you very personally based on the last thing I just showed you, which is the fact that don't look at me now as a professional caregiver or as someone who's done research and teaching in this area. Look at me as the same as all of you. We're all in this together, okay? Caregiving is that central component of our experience that allows us to sustain our lives. It is so central to what we do with others that most time we take it for granted. When we take care of our little kids as they grow up, caregiving is done with so much optimism, with so much evidence of growth and development, that it is generally, as difficult it may be on time and like, rather than being a burden, it's frequently a combination of burden, joy, and a sense of development. But that's not the way caregiving is for tragedies, for health catastrophes like stroke or Alzheimer's disease or end-of-life issues in heart failure, liver failure, kidney failure. Caregiving at those times is coming to confront extraordinary demands on us as care receivers, as family and lay care receivers. Demands of exhaustion of our energies, exhaustion of our time, even exhaustion of our resources. And this talk is about enduring. It's a non-Hollywood emphasis that I'm giving you, okay? Most of the time in American society, we like to talk about resilience. I think resilience is nonsense. I think that most of us do not experience resilience. We endure. Enduring doesn't mean, by the way, that we can't have a good time. We can't go to Jay's Oyster Bar and have a Guinness and 12 Pemmican oysters. It's enduring is the fact that we just get through, and it takes everything we have to get through. And getting through also has its joys and has its deep meanings for us, but it is in fact something to think in a very hard way about. How do we endure so that the care we give is human and personal, and so that we ourselves bring that care into our bodies as part of the purposefulness of our lives? And so the issue with caregiving that I present to you at the end is a layered issue. On the one hand, we can go in a direction, as we have a discussion now, of what can we do to revitalize caregiving in the healthcare system and in medicine. I've done a lot in that area. Or we can go into the existential direction. What is it that we do that makes caregiving more feasible in the life of ordinary people like us? And then there's the third direction, which is the one I tried to catch with the subtitle. And that is that for ordinary people like us, I think that caregiving is one of those morally transformative acts that changes who we are, opens up new possibilities, side by side with the burdens I've talked about, revitalizes us and gives us the possibility of change in a direction of meaning. Thank you very much. Happy to take your questions.
Yep, this is a time for questions. Please use the microphone. There are microphones on both sides of the room. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question.
We have a question back here.
So there's a lot of different cultures throughout the world, including like Japan and Vietnam, and I know there's a lot of different social, family structures. Do you think in America particularly we're kind of losing that ability to do the caregiving? And if we are, what do you think we could do to try to change that? Do we need to have the devastating impact to re-get the caregiving, or do we have to totally reform?
Yeah,
the
that's a great question. Thank you for that. Let's do it from starting outside the United States and moving to the United States. So Japan is really interesting, because in 15 years, only 15 years from now, Japan will be the first society ever in which 40% of the population will be over 60 years of age. Okay? There has never been a society like that. 25 years from now, 20% of our society will be over 60 years of age. At that time, about 25% of Chinese will be over 60 years of age. And in China, with the one-child family, husband and wife will be responsible for 4 seniors. Okay? Enormous pressure. So the first thing is that we're not entering the same world we've thought about in the past. We're entering a very different world. Now think about Japan for a minute. Japan, together with Norway and Finland, have examples of some of the very best elder care there can be. In Japan and Norway, for example, if you need a home health aide, you get the home health aide free in their national health systems, okay? Takes away the issue of your own resources, whether you're rich or poor. You get that home health aide free. The Japanese simply, it'll be impossible for the Japanese to keep that going, and probably will be impossible for the Norwegians to keep that going. So now let's bring it back to the States. I told you in the States, if we look at elder care, that 70%, 70% of the elderly live on their own or with families, and only 30% are institutionalized. Now think for a minute if there were 10% change in that. If instead of 70% of the elderly living on their own or with families, only 60% were. That would totally and completely overwhelm all our hospitals, all our nursing homes, all our long-term care facilities. Hence, if you think about this in a hard-headed way, exactly what policy should be about is focus, yes, on institutions to some degree, but principally on families and on individuals themselves in terms of what resources are needed to sustain people. And the first thing that comes to mind are knowledge resources, okay? So we have locked up knowledge resources by a professional system in which we don't give those knowledge resources to people in a systematic way. So for example, you can use the internet and look up things about Alzheimer's disease or any neurodegenerative disease like ALS or Parkinsonism. Half of what you read will be totally wrong, okay? And the other half of questionable significance. Actually, that's not so much different than, for our medical graduates. We say for medical graduates at Harvard Medical School, we say that 50% of what we teach you, we know in 10 years will be seen as wrong. We're just not sure which 50%. And that means a lifetime of learning, but at least the medical student has the ability to take in that learning because of the knowledge structures have been made available. We haven't made those available. Part of that cognitive knowledge structure may be changing prescription ways so that families can begin to prescribe for members who are sick without necessarily have to turning to a doctor, to a physician. Controversial, but a very interesting possibility. Second is financial resources. And I'm sure for all of you who've been caregivers, you realize that society, including our society, depends on a vast sea of caregiving that is not recompensed. Okay? Not recognized and not recompensed. Well, you've got to rethink that. Rethink about how do you begin to recompense caregiving? Because if you don't recompense it and you place the emphasis on institutions, it's going to both overwhelm institutions and overwhelm budgets. So we're in an era of patient-centered care. We believe in the role of families and lay systems. Hence, we have to reformulate the way we think about how care is delivered. Third issue is what's happening in our healthcare system. What actually happens in our healthcare system? Now here we have a number of people I already met in the audience who contribute to the healthcare system. In the average visit in primary care. That would be in family medicine, in primary care, internal medicine, in med-peds. The average visit of a patient and doctor for a follow-up visit after the initial visit is about somewhere between 12 and 14 minutes in the United States. In that period of time, let's say the patient is a 74-year-old like me, and let's say that patient has worse health than I do. It has, let's say, diabetes. So managing diabetes with, say, peripheral vascular disease, and maybe with a polyneuropathy, painful feelings in the feet, for example, maybe with eye ground changes and some diminution in seeing. Just keeping up with the chart in terms of the electronic medical record means the doctor's going to spend a fair amount of that 12 minutes just looking at the screen to see what the laboratory values are, et cetera. Then there's going to be a physical exam. How much time is left in that 12 minutes to be able to find out what's really at stake for the patient that may be central to the caregiving? Relatively little time. Relatively little time. So we have to think about the timing of care. And I think we're going to come to different ideas 30 years from now than we're emphasizing now. I just want to tell you without being able to present the evidence because it's a totally different talk. But for people with serious chronic illness, and if you want to have good care, it's not going to be cost effective by our current standards. It's going to be effective, but it's going to cost. Okay? And that's something we have to think about. Do we value life enough? Do we value care enough that we're willing to pay for it? And we have to think about that in a very substantial way. I just told you about my life with my wife. Now, I had a pretty good income. I'm not a wealthy man, but I had pretty good income from Harvard. I fortunately had, and my wife and I had long-term care insurance. Nonetheless, in the last 6 months, I took care of her for 10 years. In the last 6 months of her life, she went into a nursing home because she became paralyzed just before death in the last 6 months, and I could no longer lift her and take care of her. That 6 months cost me $150,000. Now, fortunately, I was able to pay that. And that was $150,000 with home health care. I mean, with a long-term care policy. Okay? Hence, what can most people do? Most people are going to be, in the United States, going to be at a loss for the financial resources to do the kind of care and take care of people that they want. That's why we have to rethink end-of-life caregiving, have to rethink what caring is about. When it's possible to sustain care in the family, we've got to invest in it because that turns out to be a hell of a lot cheaper than investing in institutions. So at every level, it's easy to talk about the economics, but what we don't talk about is the details of care. We don't talk about the things that I just defined as caregiving, which is the feeding, the ambulating, the bathing, the taking care of, the crying, the supporting, the being deeply involved. It's that human part of care that you refer to in that question that I think we really should be concerned with. Will we lose this? Will we lose the human? Will we lose the human in two domains? In the domain of institutions and even in the family domain. If we don't have the resources, if we don't have the supports, if we are overwhelmed with care, with caregiving, if we abandon others, if we feel we can't endure and sustain things, you just look again at my experience, how important respite care for the caregiving caregiver is. I fortunately had a fantastic son and daughter, and even a mother who's now 102, who helped me in every way possible. And indeed, Harvard helped me in every way possible, doing all the things they possibly could for me. Most people don't have the things that I had, and yet I found that I just barely endured. Okay? I had a great home health aide, a fantastic home health aide. And that's one thing all of you should be thinking about, how incredibly important home health aides are. She worked 5 days a week, 9 to 5, And I worked 7 days a week, all weekend long, and 5 to 9 during the week. But that 9 to 5 allowed me to continue a career and keep going in these things. How do we organize systems of care, our lives, so that we can keep that human side of care going? If I leave you with anything, it's to raise that question and not be afraid of raising that question. It's got to be raised politically. It's got to be raised institutionally. It's got to be raised morally. How about other questions?
I think we have a question from a gentleman in the middle here. Here you go, sir.
Yes, I'm a caregiver for about 3 years. My wife has Parkinson's. And I'm beginning to see some new things happening for me and for her. And one of those is it's a kind of transformative experience in the sense that I see a part of her that I've never seen before. And I think she sees that in me. So I think I'm in the stage of enduring where it's good enduring. We're not at, you know, she's not ambulatory or anything like that, but there is a part of that that has value to me.
Great. And that's what I meant by a moral transformation. I think the caregiving, for me, actually made me a better person. Okay, I was a very tough academic who was known to be, to not suffer fools, okay? I've come to realize that fools are very important in life, and actually, most of us are fools, and that it made me a different kind of person. So there's no question, that's why I put in the subtitle the idea of a moral transformation. But it's a very difficult moral transformation, and I hope your journey with your wife is an easy one. But for many people, the journey changes at different levels. My experience with Alzheimer's and in my own personal care, and my experience as a psychiatrist working with families of patients with different kinds of neurodegenerative diseases, has been that as different levels of needs are reached, we begin to find that our ability to accommodate becomes more challenged, so that we're at higher levels, find ourselves challenged but able to deal with things. And as things get more severe, we discover that the challenge becomes harder for us. So I wish you all the success you can get in this regard.
I think we have a woman in the middle, Neil.
Have you or are you planning to write a book about your 10 years of caregiving and what you learned?
Yeah, I am writing a book. I'm on the 4th draft, having torn up the last 3. I am writing a book it's called Taking Care. Cares, Taking Care, and Caregiving. And it suggests, I can give you sort of the outline of it, it suggests that caregiving is really part of a process that begins developmentally with the taking on of cares, as we learn to take on cares, as we learn to worry about things, worry about what's important and what's less important. That it has a component that has to do with learning how to take care of our worlds. In this regard, I think a lot of it, frankly, is gendered. I have 4 grandkids between the ages of 11 and 13, and I can see that boys have a tougher time of taking care, and the girls are socialized to take care in a way that we need to really rethink as a culture as to what are the elements of taking care that we all should be developed to handle. And then coming, I think, into caregiving has to do with this reciprocity in a life. So I was married for 46 years. For the first 37 of those years, my wife took care of me. And for the next 9 of those years, or 9 and a half of them, I took care of her. And I think that sense of reciprocity is one of the things that keep us going. If you want to read an interesting small book on caregiving, read a book called The Caregiver and the pseudonym of the writer is Aaron Altera, and I wrote the preface to it. It's called The Caregiver. And actually, the real writer, the name of the writer is E.S. Goldman, who was a great writer for the New Yorker and chronicled his experience of caring for his wife with Alzheimer's disease. Of course, most care in Alzheimer's, often much of it goes the other way. It's women caring for men. And it's the men caring for women gives a somewhat different view of this. Both are important.
We have a question down here in the first row. Here you go, ma'am.
So if I take this into the political arena, my sort of when I talk with people who have different political points of view, there's sort of the politics of those who feel it's the act of the individual and sort of that American idea, you do things for yourself, by yourself, et cetera, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Yeah. And then there's the idea of the collective, or the collective society and taking care of others. And it sounds to me, I mean, I might add that I think some of the individualists are also religious people. I mean, I think they're religious people on both sides, but is it through religion that we find this collective support that sounds like we have to have, or is there some other way of getting the political will to make this happen?
Well, first, first of all, it's a terrific question, and you could teach a whole course about this, and frankly, I do teach a whole course about this. But if you begin with that part of your question that's cultural, and then the parts that's political, it's part of the American mythology that we are individuals who pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. In fact, if you look at study after study, it shows that all Americans are embedded in networks, and all of us advance with the aid of networks. We all stand on the shoulders of others. Okay, we like to play that down in terms of the idea of the single hero in that regard. But if you move it over to the political domain, I think that the issues are the following: that we've allowed a language of economics, a free market language, to dominate healthcare without a clinical language or a language of caregiving to balance it. Now, as I said, if you go back and read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, after all, being the grandfather of market economies, he said that markets will destroy life as we know it unless they're balanced by moral systems. Okay? So we need to balance it by forcing our politicians in every domain to come to terms with the human dimension of caregiving and to ask what's going to shore that up, what's going to keep that going. How do we make that count for something? Because all of us know that there are things that money can't buy. There are things that money can't buy. You can buy caregiving to a certain degree, but the human dimensions of caregiving, there are parts of it you cannot buy. And that comes from the quality of relationships, from the commitment to others, from responsibility. And there we have to be doing those things to support that human aspect of care rather than tearing it down or destroying it. And I think, again, that this is not an area where politicians have been comfortable. But I want to go beyond that. I want to suggest something else that's actually the bigger political issue here. The bigger political issue is, what would happen if we took a caregiving perspective, as I suggested early in the talk, to domains outside of medicine? Supposing to the broader area of social welfare, to the criminal justice system, even to our foreign policy. We insisted on a perspective that had caregiving built into it. We recognized that we're all in this together, that we're trying to organize a world that's livable for us, for all of us, and sustainable. Caregiving, in a way, relates to the environment in a very important way. And so I think there actually is a broader political agenda here than just the one that I've covered.
Let's see. Here you go, sir.
Josh.
Oh, sorry.
Those of us who are in primary care, I see a lot of burnout. Those of us like myself in our 60s who've been in it for a long time, I think have kind of figured it out. The ones I worry about are the physicians and other providers who are in their 40s and 50s, who are discouraged with what they're confronted with day to day. And they're burning up to the point where they're saying, you know, I'm going to do this for another 4 or 5 years, then I'm going to quit. Or I'm going to go part-time. And a huge loss of medical knowledge right at the time that those of us, boomers, are going to need that care. What kind of resources do you know of that could really come to help and support those of us in medical groups who are confronting this real important issue?
First of all, I think it's another great question, and it speaks to this whole idea of enduring. How do you endure practice, as it were? I think there are ways of sustaining caregiving in practice, and I think some of them have been out there for a long time and can be modified culturally and socially to be more amenable for a particular setting. So, for example, I'm very supportive of Ballant groups. Do you know Ballant groups? Ballant was a psychoanalyst in Britain in the 1940s and 50s who wrote a very interesting book called The Doctor, His Illness, and the Patient. I'm sorry, The Patient, His Illness, and the Doctor. I had just reversed. And Ballant thought that he worked with primary care physicians in the UK, and then family docs in the US brought Ballant groups to this place, to the US. So, for example, John Guyman at the University of Washington had all his residents and doctors in continuing medical education go through Ballant groups. And in a Ballant group, you have a facilitator and you have a group of practitioners. And it's an opportunity to talk about those things those difficult affects that often lead to feelings of frustration and burnout with others, sharing cases, sharing feelings, sharing difficulties, and getting support through groups. And I found Ballant groups to be really extraordinary. I ran them for a number of years, ran Ballant groups. There are many other kinds of those tactical, these are not strategic, but tactical interventions to help in this period of time. But I would say that the larger issues are for our profession as a whole and for medical education more broadly. And that my own sense is that there's an immense interest today in medical education. It just is a huge interest in the medical humanities, in global health, in areas in which you can see clearly a commitment of values to work, okay? And so what we need to do is to shift some of that momentum to support primary care. I think primary care is the centerpiece of what our healthcare system is and should be about, and it needs a tremendous amount of support, just as you mentioned. And it's going to be these resources, these personal, moral resources that contribute. But let me give you some other examples as well. Years ago, the head of the Centers for Disease Control at that time, David Senser, left the CDC and went to be the president of Swarthmore College, a great college, liberal arts school in Pennsylvania. And he did a study, as you would expect of an epidemiologist who had all the power of being a university president. He did a study comparing the graduates of Swarthmore, Haverford, and I think Franklin and Marshall, who had gone into medicine. And he compared them, he asked them 20 years after they graduated from college and were in the early phase of their medical practice to look back on their education and say what they would do differently if they had the chance to go back and be undergraduates all over again. And a huge number of them, I forget the actual figure, I think it was like 75 or 80%, said if they went back to their undergraduate education, knowing what they knew now out in practice, they would have taken many more courses in art history, in archaeology, in geology, to enrich their lives and make their engagements in the world, richer, as it were. And I think that we're seeing that happen now. We're seeing that. I see at Harvard huge numbers of students who go on to medical school, but major in the humanities and social sciences. And for medical students and for residents who are trying to develop medical humanities experiences which can keep life in balance and enrich that personal life that can keep the professional life going. So my sense is there are many things, and what we need to do is actually take part in this and figure out ourselves you've identified a key problem. How can we contribute to it?
Question from one of our regulars here in front.
As I understood it, you had mentioned that it is both imperative that the people who need the care be open to accepting it, as well as those who are able to give it. How is that bridge broken when we are, as Lynn said, very independent people? Although my parents may put you to shame and call you a little boy, they're not at your mother's age yet, but are very resistant to help.
Yeah.
And how you break that down, and then going forward with them always not wanting to be a burden, how do you see the movements of the so-called Hotel Californias, the programs in Oregon and now in Vermont for end-of-life decisions going forward?
Well, thank you. That's another great question. Gee, I should just come here for the questions. First of all, if we reverse the order of your question, I think there's no doubt that the biggest legacy of the baby boomers, I think, will be to change entirely how we see end of life. We already see the lineaments of this developing, and it's going to develop everywhere. And that is that the emphasis on a life with dignity in which people themselves will play a role in saying when to call it quits. And we'll have the means of doing that. I'm not going to, this is not a lecture on that topic, but I see all the evidence that this is going to change all over the country. The other part of it is really this is the whole message I'm trying to give, that if in fact we emphasize the humanness, the humanity of the caregiving relationship, then the care receiver and the caregiver, their world, their relationships are the centerpiece of that kind of relationship. So where those relationships are deeply fraught, as they are in many families, that's going to carry right over into what's at stake and what's difficult in the caregiving relationship. And that's going to have to be addressed in some way, addressed by family, addressed by religionists, addressed by physicians. But that's going to be the core of what we focus on. That is sustaining those relationships, improving them, doing what it takes to be able to influence them. Once you take this seriously, then of course, problems in the relationships that lead to things like denial of illness, okay, and continuing driving after you have a serious neurodegenerative disease, that becomes a tremendous problem. Of how do you have an elderly parent? How do you help them to come to terms with the fact they've got to stop driving, which is probably the centerpiece of what independence means in the United States culturally as well as personally. So it's a big issue, but it's resolvable if in fact one sees the relationship as the core issue, as opposed to the pharmacology or the institutions. We see the relationship at the core, we can address those things. Thanks.
One more question.
Okay, just to take that statement about the relationship being the core, what about redefining what you're focusing on into a creative, I mean, you showed us beautiful art to describe, so if this relationship could go to the strength of the caregiver as a creative person, rather than the scientific world that, other pieces, is that a piece
Yes.
that maybe we need to concentrate more on than?
Yeah. Wonderful question. That's a wonderful question to end on. Now, you know, I come from Harvard, and at Harvard, Henry James and William James loom large because the James family lived in Cambridge. William James spent his whole career with Harvard. We regard at Harvard William James as the great writer and Henry as the great psychologist, okay? Because if you read Henry's novels, you realize he was a greater psychologist than William. Henry James wrote a short story, which I would commend to any physician in the audience, and anyone in the audience. It's called The Middle Years, and it's in a collection of his short stories called The Aspern Papers. And in this, he has an elderly writer who's dying, probably of heart disease, and being taken care of by a young physician. The young physician has a secret which the elderly writer intuits, that he himself, the young physician, wants to be a great writer. And so at the end of life, before he dies, the elderly writer tries to convey wisdom both about writing and about medicine and about life. And he says the following: "We work in the dark. We do what we can. We give what we have. Our passion is our anxiety, and passion is our task." Okay? Our passion is our anxiety, because whether that passion is for creativity in our lives or science, and whether it's focused in our caregiving, we know we need a critical sense to balance the passion. Otherwise, passion goes off the rails. That critical sense comes from that part of us that attends to the financing of things, to the practical realities of life. But Henry James doesn't say, stop with passion is our anxiety. Passion is our task, he says. Passion is our task. And I think that's what I would rephrase your question about, and what I've tried to show tonight. That our humanness comes alive in our commitment to others, in that passion for life, in that passion for living, in that passion for the other person, in passion in the world. And I would say that that's our task. Your task, as you beautifully elaborated it, my task in the poor way I tried to do tonight. Thank you very much.